In this lecture, we will define nervous system and describe its purpose with regard to function. Did you know that your brain and your spinal cord comprise your central nervous system? We will describe the anatomical divisions in this lecture. The primary cell of the central nervous system is the neuron, and we will examine its structure as well. Finally, we will briefly examine the neuromuscular junction, or the connection between your nervous system and your muscular system. So let's get started. Nervous system can be formally defined this way: an organ system that coordinates the activities of muscles, monitors organs, constructs and processes data received from the senses, and initiates actions. Wait, what? Okay, how is this? The nervous system includes all of the neural tissue in the body. Now, as direct and concise as that definition is, it remains vague for our purposes here. Okay, how's this one? The nervous system is composed of all of the cells, tissues, and organs which together receive and process sensory information and in response affect changes in the organism. Now understand, of course, that said changes may be physiological, physical, or both, and that's a Jeffries quote, by the way. So from my definition, you can break the nervous system down like this. When you think of cellular components, your mind probably automatically goes to the neuron. The basic functional unit of the nervous system is indeed the neuron. However, there are armies of other cells. We call them neuroglia or glia, which protect the neuron, form supporting networks for neurons, and help regulate the interstitial fluid. Now we will explore the neuron very shortly. Neural tissues include blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and connective tissues that together form the organs of the nervous system, namely the brain and spinal cord. Now we will check out the gross anatomy of the brain in the next lecture, and we'll check out the cranial nerves later in this section. So if we extracted a single neuron, well, it would look kind of like this. So this is the body of the neuron. We call it the soma. Here, of course, is the cell's nucleus. The body extensions out here are called dendrites. Dendrites are processes that extend out from the soma and which receive sensory input from other neurons. Now this long arm here is the axon. The axon is the long, sometimes very long, neuronal process that carries or propagates the electrical impulse or action potential. You'll hear those terms a lot coming up. The sections here are myelin. I'll say more about myelin in a minute, but I liken this material to the plastic covering on an extension cord. That protective covering on your extension cord insulates the copper wire, which carries the electric current from the environment. Without that insulation, current would short out, and your television, for example, would stop working. Well, myelin does the same thing. It insulates the axon, which, like that copper wire, carries the electric current from the environment of the brain. If the myelin was not there, then your axons would short out and some part of your body would stop working. More on that shortly. However, unlike the covering on your extension cord, which is continuous, the myelin covering your axons is deposited in sections, as you see here, leaving tiny sections of axon exposed. Now these little gaps, or nodes, in the myelin are called nodes of Ranvier, named after French anatomist Louis-Antoine Ranvier, who discovered them in the 19th century. And by the way, you see here the nucleus of the cell that makes the myelin. These are oligodendrocytes called Schwann's cells. Now at the end of the axon, then, you see any number of synaptic terminals. Neurons are connected to one another at the junctions called synapses. So the neuron pictured here can communicate with a number of other neurons via these synapses. So looking here at the real deal, you see the body of the neuron here. The nucleus, of course, is here. You see a couple of incoming dendrites out here. This long extension here is the axon. Now we don't see the terminal synapses in this presentation. And out here and here you see neuroglia or glia. Now glia consists of various protective and supportive cells, astrocytes for one if you're taking a live A&P course. So myelin is a lipid-rich material produced by oligodendrocytes in the brain and which wraps around the nerve fiber, the axon, like a blanket. Now it functions to protect the axon and insulate it from the interstitial milieu. Also called the myelin sheath, the process of forming myelin is of course myelination. Now the action potential, which is generated in the soma, is able to travel very fast and efficiently down the axon due to the presence of myelin. So in this microscopic presentation showing a bundle of axons, and by the way, we see this specimen under a light microscope, so axons are comparatively large. You see the nerve fiber, the axon, right here. Protective myelin is here. Here it is on the other side. This tiny gap is a node of Ranvier. You see another one right there. Now myelin forms in segments, leaving tiny gaps or nodes of exposed axon between them. These nodes of Ranvier allow for the saltatory propagation of the action potential. Now saltatory simply refers to jumping, like a frog, movement of the action potential as it moves down the axon. So the action potential is able to very quickly jump from node to node, and in this way travel much faster than it could without the nodes. So it goes something like this. The axon is here. Here is a node of Ranvier. Now these segments represent myelin sheath, and you see the nuclei of oligodendrocytes here. So this little animation then demonstrates the saltatory behavior of the action potential. Of course, it's much faster than this, but you get the idea. Now, demyelination is the progressive destruction of the myelin sheath surrounding, insulating, and protecting the nerve fiber or the axon. Demyelination can result from chronic exposure to heavy metals like mercury and lead, leading to a loss of sensation if a sensory nerve, and or a loss of function if a motor nerve. Now, loss of sensation and function equate to numbness and paralysis, respectively. So autoimmunity seems to be a major culprit in diseases involving demyelination. Autoimmunity is a chronic condition in which your immune system fails to recognize self and begins destroying your own cells and tissues, like myelin, as though they were foreign materials. Autoimmune diseases that maybe you've heard of include Guillain-Barré syndrome, which affects peripheral nerves, and multiple sclerosis, which affects nerves of the brain, spinal cord, and eye. Now, it's very easy to learn the facts of all of this anatomy stuff, but lose sight of the most important fact of all. That is, all of these things that you learn about can be superimposed, for lack of a better word, onto real people just like you. Take multiple sclerosis, for example. Multiple sclerosis, or MS, is a progressive demyelination of neuronal axons of the central nervous system, or CNS, that's your brain and spinal cord, but predominantly in the brain. Now, as myelin is destroyed, action potentials are disrupted, leading to cognitive or functional, or both, disability. So the most common form, there are 4 degrees of MS, by the way. The most common form is called relapsing remitting, which means that after an exacerbation, that's an attack, a person will recover with or without disability, and then after a period of time, another exacerbation will ensue. And that process will continue throughout the remainder of a person's life. Attack, recover, or relapse, remission, relapse, remission. MS affects more women than men. The first exacerbation usually occurs around age 40. This autoimmune disease is a worldwide phenomenon. Multiple sclerosis is no respecter of persons, as people like celebrities Montel Williams, Ozzy Osbourne's son Jack, and actress Terry Garr suffer from this debilitating and, by the way, incurable disease. Okay, so remember how the normal action potential propagates. Demyelination disrupts the normal propagation of the action potential, and so you see an area of demyelination, which again leaves the axon exposed right here, and so propagation of the action potential kind of looks like this. Okay, that's enough microanatomy and physiology for now. So jumping out and looking at the big picture, now your nervous system has 2 anatomical divisions. The first is the central nervous system, or CNS. that consists of your brain and spinal cord. And by the way, nerves originating on your brain are called cranial nerves, which we'll examine in a couple of lectures from now. And nerves originating on your spinal cord are called, obviously, spinal nerves. The second division, the second anatomical division, is the peripheral nervous system, or PNS. It consists of the neural tissue outside of your central nervous system. That includes the nervous tissue and nerves servicing your arms and legs, your internal organs, organ systems, and so on and so forth. So, in other words, all the systems that we have discussed so far, right? Skeletal system, digestive system, remember your muscular system, respiration, circulation, lymphoid system. Wow, we really have come a long way together, haven't we? But the nerves and nervous tissue servicing all of these systems, well, that's all peripheral nervous system. So in this course, Anatomy of the Head and Neck, we're obviously focused on the central nervous system and even more specifically on the brain. So thinking about your brain, then, we can differentiate two types, if you will, of neural tissue: gray matter and white matter. So if you extract your brain, okay, well, not your brain, obviously, but a brain, then what you're looking at is gray matter. We call this part of the brain the cerebrum, and the outer part that you are looking at is the cerebral cortex. Your cerebral cortex then consists of gray matter. The cerebral cortex governs everything that you think about with regard to brain function. For example, your vision is controlled by cerebral cortex, as is your hearing and senses of taste and smell. When you walk or run, play tennis, plant flowers, or anything, your cerebral cortex is hard at work. When you study the anatomy of the head and neck, or engage in any sort of analytical thinking, paint a masterpiece, or fall in love, you get the idea: cerebral cortex. All of that to say this: your cerebral cortex, and more specifically your gray matter, is responsible for everything you do, say, think, and feel. Now, if you were a fan of the highly acclaimed television series, then you will remember that Walt was a co-founder of the firm Gray Matter. Now you know why the company was called Gray Matter, right? Your gray matter is the source of all that you do, say, think, and feel. So if we examine the sagittal section of the brain, then we can see how the cortex, remember now that's gray matter, sort of wraps around and covers the inner surface here. The remainder of your cerebrum is, you can guess, white matter. In fact, actually the bulk of your brain is white matter. The cortex is only about 1/8 of an inch thick. So what then is the difference? Well, now that you know what myelin is, you will understand when I tell you that white matter consists of myelinated axons. That's right, it's the presence of myelin that gives white matter its lighter, not really white, just lighter color. Gray matter then is darker because there is no myelin. Functionally, though, white matter, remember that's myelinated nerve fibers, connect parts of your brain. So, for example, white matter connects the right and left halves of the cerebrum, thereby allowing your right brain to communicate with your left brain. Long story short, yes, this is another of my umbrella concepts, gray matter equals function, while white matter equals connection. So there are two functional divisions of the nervous system as well. The first is the somatic nervous system, or SNS. It controls the voluntary contractions of your skeletal muscles. Now, you will recall that your skeletal muscle is completely under your conscious control. Remember, you either choose to walk or you choose not to walk. So the muscles of your tongue and your muscles of mastication, for example, are all under control of your somatic nervous system. The second functional division is the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. It provides automatic regulation of smooth muscle, remember your esophagus, cardiac muscle, remember that's your heart, and gland secretions, remember your salivary glands. Finally, I want to introduce you to the neuromuscular junction, or NMJ. As its name implies, the neuromuscular junction is the junction or connection between the nervous system and the muscular system, specifically skeletal muscle. As you have already surmised, I am sure, skeletal muscle contracts as a result of electrical current, that's an action potential, generated by the nervous system. So each individual muscle fiber is controlled by a single motor neuron whose axon ends in a multi-branched synaptic terminal. This multi-branched synaptic terminal is called a motor end plate. Now, the motor end plates look to me like a group of little lead pads, if you're familiar with the EKG process. It is very recognizable even under the simple light microscope. So in this specimen, here are your skeletal muscle fibrils. Your axon is right there, and these are neuromuscular junctions. You can't mistake these for anything else. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. Hey, Jonathan, you showed us a bunch of people running. This is anatomy of the head and neck, right? I know. But we're talking about the connection between the nervous system and the muscular system, right? So don't forget that your muscles of mastication, muscles of the neck, muscles of facial expression, and the extrinsic muscles of the eyes are all skeletal muscles. So you have plenty of neuromuscular junctions in your head and neck. So, now that you're familiar with the basic structures of the nervous system, we will begin our survey of the gross anatomy of same in the next lecture as we check out the cerebrum. So I hope to see you shortly.